George.
It's Red Fence!
It's Red Fence.
Do your homework.
How you doing, George?
Hungry. Sorry, listeners. I'm eating.
Well, while you're eating, we'll do our first things first. So, the question for today, on a more personal note, what is your felt experience towards around babies and small children? So, since you're still eating, I'll answer my own question.
Do it. Go for it.
All right. Well, I was 5 years old when my little brother was born, so I definitely have happy memories of helping my mom take care of him, of snuggling him and playing with him when he was little. And our relationship was very affectionate and physical. And that may be in part because he has Down syndrome, and so wrestling and snuggling were like the ways that we connected, less so than conversation. I mean, words and ideas just mattered less than touch did. Like, and even today, like when we're together, we sit on the couch and like we snuggle and we touch each other and, you know, and we like recite funny poems. And, you know, if the words are there, they're usually in the form of like nursery rhymes and songs and silly things like that. And there was Dr. Seuss. Like, he always loved Dr. Seuss, and so I would read those to him over and over again. We had every single one in our library at home.
Even the banned ones.
Even the banned ones. We had them all.
They're coming for you. The Dr. Seuss police are going to come get your books.
All right, so my experience of growing up as the middle child in a family that had to rearrange itself around the needs of my brother's disability, the way that his needs were brought into the mix of things like that definitely shaped me into like a stop, drop, and play approach to little kids. So physical affection, silliness, playfulness, all those things were really central to who we became as a family, in large part because of my little brother. So it was a baby-friendly and child-friendly environment. And I'm positive that prepared me for motherhood in a really profound way. I babysat when I was a teenager. I loved playing with younger children. I was definitely like the mother hen kind of a personality. And I got married young. I got married at 20, had my first kid at 26, another at 28, and then I had twins when I was 31. And I adored the experience of mothering infants. I really enjoyed little babies. I didn't enjoy pregnancy, but I did birth all of my children naturally, and I felt a lot of like accomplishment and joy in the processes of labor and birth and breastfeeding. And the days of nursing and caring for little ones were hands down like the most exhausting and all-consuming work I have ever done. But it was also some of the happiest and most fulfilling times of my life. And so part of me misses it. Another part of me is like thrilled that it's over, but I definitely feel nostalgia for it. So yeah, I was both sad and I was relieved to see that phase of life go. And there's just a lot of joy in introducing new little people to the world around them. And as a parent, you feel the power that you have to shape your child's values and attention. It's like apprentice them in being human. It's this feeling of being totally responsible and having very little control of the outcome at the same time, which is humbling, which is hard. It's like, I can't mess this up, and I will mess this up at the same time. And so my youngest are now 11, so baby days are over for me, but at least I expect baby days are over for me, but I really look forward to being a grandmother someday. Like, I have, both my husband and I, we have like grandparent bug. Lord willing.
That you get the closeness without the full-on exhaustive responsibility factor.
Exactly. Yeah. I would really like to be a very involved grandparent. I would love to be useful in that way. I think that'd be a lot of fun. And my husband and I still love to like flirt with babies and toddlers at Mass, because one of the really noticeable differences between like your typical Protestant worship service and your typical Catholic Mass is that even the youngest children are present with their parents for the whole thing. They don't get sent off to the nursery or children's church. And every Protestant church I've been to has like a nursery or a cry room to separate the disruptiveness.
Cry room?
It's called a cry room, yeah. Where there's like a glass, you know, so that the mom can like see the service. Typically the mom, maybe the dad can see the service and like hear through a speaker coming into the room, but no one can like hear the of the children crying.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, it's definitely a thing. So every Protestant church I've been in has something like that to segregate like kids' disruptiveness from the worship experience of the adults. But at Mass, there's this perpetual background hum of kid noises, especially if you're at like the 9 o'clock service. Yeah. It depends on which one, you know, we get the little kids in it. But, you know, punctuated with like the occasional cry or laugh or shriek. And it means that there's usually some adorable little person in a pew nearby that we can like make faces at. Right?
Sure.
And you can like look from the baby's face and like right over her shoulders, like the statue of Mary holding, baby Jesus, on her hip and with his little hands reaching up to touch her face. So like the statuary reflects the reality of who's in the sanctuary. And I love this about Catholicism, that it includes the messy, noisy, disruptive cuteness of small children in the highest, holiest, and most reverent moments of liturgical worship. Like those do not cancel each other out there. And I think that's what grace is. Like everyone is welcome, even the little one who just blew out his diaper and is like competing with the incense for smelling the sanctuary, or the little one who like babbles through the whole homily, It's just, yeah, it's very real. And there's this delightful article I read years ago by Haley Stewart called How My Children Didn't Ruin Mass. And it describes this experience perfectly, where she's like really anxious that, oh, my kid did this, and then they were shouting, and then they were running on the aisle, and then they almost grabbed the host for the priest, and they did it, but then people come up to her afterwards and are like, oh, you're doing such a good job with your babies. Oh, let me hold the baby for you. And oh, it was such a delight to see you nursing your baby in Mass. Like people were really welcoming to her, and she realized, oh, okay, this is actually okay. This is how it's supposed to be, rather than my kids are ruining everything for everybody. Because it's true. Like if children are welcome, then all of us are welcome. And so,
right, because in a general normalized sense, children are always the people who need the most accommodation, because they're learning the norms. They're growing into the capacity to sit still and be silent and follow along. Right. They're growing that capacity. They're not born with that capacity.
Exactly. And is it like, do we keep them separated until they've got their shit together, and then they can join us? Or is it like, part of the whole thing is we gradually introduce them to it, and we stay flexible by continuously being interrupted and being okay with that.
I mean, it would be hypocritical otherwise, wouldn't it, from a Catholic perspective, to be like, don't use birth control, have lots of babies, but your babies can't come here.
Exactly.
I mean, that would be... Yeah. That would be crazy.
Yeah, and so that's why I think, like, pro-life means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but I think one of the things it means is we are flexible with the messiness and the disruptiveness of babies and children, that they are included as they are. And so pro-life means having a noisy service, right?
That is a fascinating way to look at it.
It's like, it affords a whole world in which children are seen differently and included differently. So it's not just about don't have an abortion or no birth control.
It's also not just about like all children, like all circumstances to give birth are the same either. Because I mean, Catholics don't want you to have sex before marriage.
Right.
So they're not welcoming children just randomly. Like, go out and make as many children.
Oh, yeah. It's bounded in a certain way.
So pro-life means... Yeah. It is bounded. And pro-life we don't seem to talk about that. Because it's not about the sort of like fetishization of having kids just to have kids. I read that book, which we might do at one point on the podcast about, the argument, the sort of statistical argument for two-parent families and how careful the author is to not suggest there's just any moral difference. It's like, okay... trying hard, too hard. Right. Yeah. Because, before technology, it's only the moral difference that enforces those. It's basically saying to people, it's not saying to people, oh, this is statistically better for long-term outcomes, which is an argument that moves no one ever. I mean, maybe it moves policymakers, but it doesn't move people. Right. People are moved by, like, I'm going to look at you strange if you behave this way. That's what moves people. Yeah, we live within moral stories. We're typically not moved by statistics, but policy tends to be based on statistics. So, but I like that. I like that idea of openness not just towards children for what they are, because they represent the future, but also just the idea that, if a child is welcome in Mass, so are messed up adults. Exactly. Like, so is the drug addict. So is, like, the blind person who brings her dog up to the front row in the sanctuary. I mean, or, like, all kinds of people. All kinds of people can come. Yeah. It's a different understanding of a sacred space, where it's putting the sort of proximity factor, foregrounding that in a way that most people, when they think of religion, they think of something sort of formalized, like, where all the sort of unniceties are left out, because it's supposed to be pretty. Right. And that's what's so interesting is that at Mass, the liturgy is very high. It's very reverent. Right. And there are lots of little children making noises through the whole thing.
Whereas my experience of Protestant churches it was much more like casual and sort of like a happy clappy, we're doing folk music together, and sort of it was casual, and yet the embarrassment of a loud child, which I mean, I had that many times, like, okay, sure, I'm the mom who's making all the other moms feel better today because I'm taking my screaming child out of the sanctuary. Mm-hmm. And everyone's like, whew, glad it's not me this week. Right. Like, I will help you all feel better because it's my kid this week. But so you had like something that was very casual, yet with this really high bar of like, don't interrupt the sermon, the 45-minute long sermon. Oh, you know, it's just it's not the mix you would think. Yeah. I don't know. The attitude of grace has always been primary for me. The idea that if some kind of human institution can be ruined by the presence of children just being children, then that's not the kid's fault. Like, that's the failure of an institution to be at peace with reality.
Oh, so from that level, you could say, from an Illichian point, Mass is not a service. It doesn't have, like, what you could call qualities of service, right? Like,
that's right.
We've talked about this before, and I think you're probably going to mention it again. Like, South Korea and public spaces. Exactly. The whole idea about having a child-free experience is the language of, you know, fee for service.
Yes.
Service level agreements. Here's my money. Here are my expectations.
Exactly. And if that mode of categorizing and thinking about things comes into the church, that to me is bad. I don't think that's appropriate at all. That it's a market consumer mentality of like, I want a certain experience while I'm here. It's like, I don't go to Mass that way. I go to Mass because, as it says, like, it's my duty and my salvation to worship the Lord. Like, I'm going there to do something, not to, like, have a feeling. And I can do the thing no matter who's noisy around me. I'm not there to, in a sense, receive. I'm there to act. I mean, I receive Christ, but I'm not there to receive the feels or you know what I mean? It's just, that's not what it's about.
It's not an experience in that sense that we associate with services like restaurant meals, like ambiance, like,
yes, or a concert, or
that's really interesting to look at it that way, because I feel like so many people's experience of just the sensitivity towards religion as people telling you what to do, it seems there's such a knee-jerk-ism about that, that really, if you stick at that level, you can't even discuss the other things that it might be and how different an experience it might be from some of these experiences that we have now that aren't doing it for us, so to speak. Like, we're getting towards the end of what you can be satisfied with through services.
It's just the wrong frame. I mean, I feel like a better analogy would be, you know, going to Mass is like going to vote. It's like, do you care about, I mean, you might get irritated if the line is long, but like, you're not going to have an experience voting. You're going to vote because it matters, and you're going to go do the thing. You know, like, I never think, well, this is a really ugly classroom to be having the setup of the voting machines in. It's like, who cares?
Interesting.
Like, you know, there's a duty upon you, and you participate. And I don't know, like, it's just, you don't sit in judgment over it. You go and you do the thing. They have like future voter stickers they give out to kids, you know? And it's the same kind of thing. Like, you, rather than be like, no, kids can't be here. It's like, no. They're going to be doing this someday. So they need to see what's up. They need to get used to it. Which means the system needs to accommodate little squirmy people putting the hands where they're not supposed to go. Like, it has to be robust enough for children. You know, and then I think of like liberal feminism. Like, if babies and children aren't welcome in that framework, you know, if the family's an enemy, then mothers aren't welcome. And if mothers aren't welcome, then that means 86% of American women aren't being served by those ideas. So, and I mean, obviously, not everyone likes babies. Not everyone has to have babies. But I do think a fundamental part of being human is to learn, at a bare minimum, to tolerate babies and to support the people who create and care for them. C.S. Lewis wrote this of himself. He said, I myself do not enjoy the society of small children, but I recognize this as a defect within myself, just as a man may have to recognize that he is tone deaf or colorblind. And I appreciate that, because he makes the case in that book for like objective value, that there are some things that just really are good. And it's not about your opinion of them. It's not about your preference for them. They're just good. And if you don't have like a taste for that, don't say, well, that means the thing isn't worth much.
Or
it's
that
like,
I deserve a space without them.
Right. It's like, I hope I can become the kind of person who can properly cultivate a respect and a taste for that thing. That is good. And, you know, I also believe in a faith whose central premise is that God became a baby. Yeah. Merry Christmas, everybody. So God was a toddler who picked his nose. God was a boy who ran around the house like a cyclone, like all little boys do. So my religion shapes my orientation to children just as much as my life experiences do. And Jesus said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So Christianity not only tolerates children, it makes them doctrinally and morally central. Like hospitality to children, to the least of these, is inseparable from hospitality to God himself. It's openness to surprise, to laughter, to recognizing that you're not in control. And it's about being open to suffering and joy at the same time. So I think that babies are like a litmus test, and that one's attitude towards them is revelatory. Like how a person is oriented toward kids, not whether they have kids of their own, but rather how they feel about the messy reality of kids, reveals a lot about their attitude towards life in general.
Yeah, it's just so interesting because in a society like C.S. Lewis grew up in, there would have been no concept of areas of life where childlessness prevailed. I mean, they just would have... The reason he could understand his personal discomfort as a taste was because it was in relation to the norm.
Right.
Like, I wonder now if that remains true, because it's so possible to enter worlds...
To avoid being around kids.
To avoid being around kids. Maybe people's understanding of that as people's relationship to that discomfort or distaste changes because it's just less normal.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, what's that woman who talks about, we've listened to her videos about how she talks about how one of the new sort of social dynamics in our society is that even new mothers will have never held a baby before they held their own baby.
Oh, yes.
What's
I
her
forgot
name?
you said that.
Show notes.
The therapist?
I have like too
Commissar?
much.
Was it Erica
It
Commissar?
wasn't her. It was someone else.
Okay.
I have too much Alzheimer's to do
But
this
that's
podcast.
right. They would have never... that strikes me as so odd because, I mean, I grew up babysitting my daughters when babysitting all summer.
I'm an only child. There were always some kids.
Yeah. Are there just not enough kids for teenage girls to babysit? Like, I don't know. Like, how does that happen? How do you not...
When families get smaller, like, they get smaller all at once. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you have a family structure of singletons and maybe a second child, the number of cousins is just going to shrink.
Yeah.
And then the next generation is going to be, unless someone has, like, a lot of kids, it's going to remain that way.
Mm-hmm. It makes you realize what a wonderful thing it is for everybody. The institution of babysitting. Like, it's great for the moms and dads who get to go out on a date, or the mom who gets to do something else, get something else done in her house because someone's watching her kids. And it's great for the little girl, for the older girls to be able to get used to babies and diapers and how to play, how to occupy a 3-year-old for 3 hours.
Yeah,
those are major life skills.
Spans that line between alloparenting and service rendering. It's like, it's on that line.
Yeah.
But I mean, historically, that would have been like the idea that you would need someone that is not in your family to watch your kids would have been like, what? You mean,
right.
Like, I mean,
because it would have been big sisters watching all the little.
My grandmother was raised by her older siblings, not by her mother.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
And,
so maybe babysitting then is sort of like the neighborhood way of compensating for small suburban families. Isolated from grandparents not living around, and so that in and of itself, then it's a compensatory mechanism. That's a pretty good one, but even that is like disappearing.
Well, even that is disappearing. Yeah.
Huh.
I mean, especially one of the aspects of that, and we've talked about this before, is trust.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah,
we live in a society where we don't trust. Did you read that recent article by what's her name? Who started Live and Let Grow, Lenore or something. I have too much Alzheimer's to do this podcast. About how the phones create anxious parents.
Oh,
because they don't trust
that
their kids are safe unless they. So it's a symbiotic thing.
Yes,
it's the phone. It's not just
both ways.
The kid not being able to be independent. It's the independence has to be gained by the parent relinquishing fear that when the child is not reachable, the child is safe.
Right.
And babysitting falls into that too.
Yep. I mean, I know this directly. Like, my daughter does not have a phone, and I drop her off to babysit at places. Every time, she and the kid have been totally fine. but I recognize in myself a little bit of anxiety. I have to be like, no, it's okay. It's all right.
Right.
This is a good world. These are good people. My daughter's a capable human being. In a pinch, she'd know what to do. And every time she has. And but I recognize, I have to work at that. I have to trust the world.
Or you have to not have the device that interrupts that trust, right? You have to, you can only cultivate that trust in the absence of another option to distrust. Like, you think about babysitting and someone goes out to dinner. Imagine the scenario in which something rises to the level of, you have to call the restaurant to get the parents to come home. I mean, that would have to be a catastrophe.
That's right.
Everything short of that is just handled.
Exactly.
Because people used to go out, leave their kids with someone. Yeah. Call you say call 911, which is the only time you need help is if it's an emergency.
Yeah. Or it's you go to the next door neighbor if something's happening.
Right.
It's you go to the neighbor.
Right.
My kids have always known that.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's crazy.
It's you go to a real person.
That world just doesn't exist anymore. The idea that you go to the neighbor before you pick up your phone. That world's gone.
Yeah.
And it's because of that device.
And I remember even as my kids were just getting old enough to leave them home alone with no adult.
Right.
I would have the talk with them of all right, yeah, you guys don't have a phone. I'm going out grocery shopping. I'll be back in an hour. If anything happens, go over see Mr. Ted, or go see Miss Deborah. You go to the adult next door, and they're going to be there, and it helps when it's there's retirees around during the day. Right. You go to the retiree.
Right. All these factors. Wow. Yeah. That's just. Yeah. Well, I guess this is something I'll say later, but for now, I will say, I love kids, other people's kids. And I think one of the things that can happen when you don't have children of your own is that you can experience a sense of connection, even a sense of awe, with many children you meet. And it reflects a kind of universal connection. Yeah. Because it's so easy to connect with children. I mean, there's a reason we have safeguarding, because children are so trusting. Yeah. And you can have this connection in a general way, and it's certainly been my experience on multiple occasions to just feel there's no barrier to that connection because I'm not biologically related to them. And I'm sure I would feel differently about my own children if I had them. But because I don't have them, my experience doesn't have that sense of differentiation through that personal bias. Right. So it remains more in this sort of universal kind of spiritual realm. Yeah. On a down-to-earth level, we were talking about alloparenting. I also don't think it was historically that unusual to have close connections with children that were not yours. Whether those were other kin relationships or even relationships outside, beyond strict kinship groups. It used to be fairly common to have wards. Right. Where an adult with means would help some orphan or some other unfortunate, help them towards adulthood, which created a sort of parental-like relationship, including, in many cases, I assume, some expectation of reciprocity later in life. Yeah. Families were larger in the old days, and so also more precarious in terms of parental loss, or even on the other end of it, parental overwhelm. Yeah. Where some children could be sent away to live with other relatives. Because there's a limit. Everybody has limits. Right. So, but we have a totally different sense of childhood now. This modern sense of childhood has come, correspondingly, the modern idea of a parent, which I think would be largely unrecognizable to someone in a Dickens novel. I agree. Not to mention how reproductive technology has created a new paradigm where it is just expected that everyone will have their own children. And I mean that in a very specific sense, as it's almost as if one's genetic offspring are like a brand. Oh. And that if you do not have brand name children, there's a sense of falling short. Because we've talked about this before on this podcast, how, one of the paradigmatic stories in the Old Testament is infertility. Yes. So that has to signal that on some societal level it was a BFD to not be able to conceive. And of course there's no recourse except prayer, which is going to be what it's going to be. Yeah. And so this idea of, prioritization of having your genetic offspring, it's only possible in a world, which has been our world for several generations now, where children are a specific choice. Yeah. They're not really an inevitable result of sexual relations, and they don't carry that precarity of some people are going to have and some people are going to have not. Right. It's there's not that sort of sorting. And one of the things that makes people charitable, I think, is an appreciation for unalterable natural hierarchies, natural differences.
Yes, right. There's nothing we can do about this. This is the way of things.
Literally. There's nothing we can do about it. So we make this space for that.
Right.
And this book is all about what happens when you try to put something in between those two places. So I can't really tell a lot of stories about having children, since I don't have any, but I can tell you a story that is in my family. I think that many of us would not be here if the attitudes that prevail now had been about having children existed a few generations ago, including myself through my father. Because my dad's parents are the kind of people who would simply not have had kids today. Because they just weren't really interested.
Yeah.
But back then, this would be the early 1940s, when you were married, children just came.
Yeah.
It was normal. Almost all other married couples, and marriage itself was a norm, obviously, had them. So did you. There was absolutely zero sense that having children was reflected on as a type of fork in the road choice. One made with the sense of, now my life is going to be this other thing. Right. And it didn't have to be that way, because my paternal grandparents didn't organize their life around their children. Their priorities remain what they had been before. And sure, okay, there's some downsides to that.
Yeah.
Like, my grandmother was one of the least emotionally available people you would meet.
Okay.
But it came with some upsides too. Like, in that family, when you could walk, you could backpack. And, when you were old enough, you could travel. I mean, my father went to Europe for months as a 13-year-old.
Wow.
Because that's what his parents did. They, drove around, and they bought a VW bus and then drove around, and you got to get out on the hills because the hills can't take all your luggage and all the people.
That's so wild.
Yeah. So my father and his younger sister did stuff like that.
Wow. Because
his parents had no concept that one's world had to significantly change to accommodate children.
The kids just joined the parents' world rather than, now we got to create a whole world for the kids around the kids.
Exactly. And it's that norm. It's that there is this is the default. You get married, you have sex, you have a baby. That's what creates that. I think back on that experience, and it's just remarkable how different it is. I mean, we live in a world now where it's not uncommon for many parents to revolve around the activities of children.
Yeah.
My favorite example of this is sports parents.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it would have been inconceivable to my paternal grandparents to spend their weekends traveling to soccer games for elite preteens. The past really is a foreign country. I mean, my dad's parents did things totally differently there. I mean, unimaginable. There was a headline I saw today about, why are we sending 11-year-olds to the Olympics? This fetishization of children when they become something other than, this natural course of events that can't be avoided, has to be tolerated.
Yeah, it's almost too precious.
Super too precious.
Yeah.
And isn't that interesting how that came about, right? So in addition to not being a mother in that strict sense, I'm also an only child. So in a real sense, I grew up with a very intentional understanding of choosing to have kids. And I think, as our listeners know, I describe myself as radically pro-choice. But nonetheless, as an older person, I no longer actually believe that freedom, which you might note has become the buzzword of Kamala Harris's just launched presidential campaign. I don't think freedom is the proper paradigm through which to view the question of children. Yeah. It shuts it down, right?
I agree.
Progressives are going to hear that, and of course, automatically jump to a barefoot and pregnant wife strapped to the stove.
Which is not what we're talking about.
But we really have to resist that knee-jerk reaction.
That's right.
Which has been sold to us by the sexual revolution.
Yeah. And
really start thinking about why the weird world, and I mean weird, Western, educated, industrialized, what's the R?
Rich,
duh. Democratic.
Yeah.
Democratic in scare quotes these days. We have to think about why the real world went from one in which it was normal to have a family, so even people like my paternal grandparents, who ended up getting divorced when my dad was 18, some fraught stuff went down. But, if they didn't have those kids, I wouldn't exist.
Right.
I mean, not everyone is a perfect parent, but,
that's right.
That's the thing. It's about the good enough parents.
That's right.
And also, my dad was the person he is because he had emotionally available people in his circle. He had his grandparents.
That's right. And they
were there for him in that way that his parents were not necessarily there for him.
Yeah.
So again, it's like you can make it work.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to be uttering like it takes a village. That has been politicized beyond the pale, but there was just a different understanding of sort of the flexibility of that relationship.
Yes. And
this book is an interesting way to sort of actually have that conversation, to actually sort of discuss this. Even if our lower birth rates are the result of choice, the fact is that none of us are choosing the large-scale effects of fewer children.
That's right.
And that's super important, I think.
Yes.
Because, this dystopian scenario goes all the way. We have where the premise is no children have been born in a generation, 25 years. But I think the lens through which it looks at individualism and social cohesion is absolutely relevant to our current situation. Mm-hmm. It throws into this dramatic relief the question of what children are for, not just for their parents, but for everyone else too.
Yeah. Yeah, I just heard a phrase, I can't remember where I heard it, but it was flipping around this, what are children for, into, no, I am for my kids. Not like, what are kids for, like, as if you're asking, like, what's this new product for? How's it going to add value to my life? Like, no. Your kids are not for anything. You are for them. Like,
right.
just turning it around.
Even when I was big into Kundalini Yoga, you read some of the teachings around that, and the guru would always say, children are your spiritual teachers. Mm-hmm. And that's really hard to appreciate in a world where we look at children as an inconvenience or something that has to be managed within these structures that are no longer so flexible. If the whole entire world is running on, Monday through Friday, 40-hour weeks, have a career, if the whole world is running on that, there's not a space for that.
Right.
There's not a space for I am for my kids. They're not compatible in that broad sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So now we've spent
half an hour,
30 minutes talking not about the book at all.
All right, well, let's introduce the book. So, the homework for today was to read The Children of Men by P.D. James, an English author best known for her murder mysteries. She wrote the book in 1992, but she set the story in 2021 in England, and she was teasing out this idea. What would the world be like if humans ceased to be able to reproduce themselves? Like, what would happen to us if we knew that the light of our species was going out? Not with a bang, but with the whimper of infertility and universal old age. So the story begins 25 years after the last live birth, and that cutoff year is popularly known as Omega in the book. And the primary character that she follows is Theodore Farron, an Oxford historian and a solitary divorcee who, tragically, killed his only child, a little toddler, by backing over her with his car.
Yeah, that is such an interesting premise.
Yeah, that really is. And throughout the book, this theme of responsibility for the death or sort of the absence of children keeps recurring, both in the personal life of Theo and then also in the collective consciousness of humanity. It's this question, how on earth could I have accidentally backed over my own child?
Unfortunately, that does happen.
It does happen. Or leaving a child in a car seat.
Oh my
in the
God,
car. Those kind of. It's just horrific. And just it's like how could I do that? And it is sheer accident. It's not. There's not this intention. And so, but then that carries over into the collective. Think of how on earth could we have a species have accidentally backed ourselves into this corner of not being able to have children?
Or in our realistic case, not choosing to have children.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And it's how are we responsible for this absence of children? And how do we honestly face and grieve, the apparently unfixable? The society described in the book is by and large orderly rather than chaotic and violent. But it's clear that that's because England still has a lot of resources and most other countries aren't this lucky. So you just kind of know by intimation that it's total hell and chaos in many other countries.
Many other places.
Right. And England is so in a sense, she's giving us the best case scenario of how this could roll, which is an interesting way to take it. Whereas the movie version of this goes much more worst case scenario, very violent.
World War Z, yeah.
Yeah, anarchy all around, which is, so the book and the movie are really totally different in that way. In this world that she describes, men are subjected to compulsory semen testing, and potentially fertile women undergo forced gynecological examinations. The government sponsors porn shops to, supposedly enliven people's sex drives. Lots of people adopt pets because they can't have children. Some even have their pets christened in church.
That was so on the verge of becoming.
I know. There's already like blessings for animals, on certain days in churches. And then some women like attach themselves to baby dolls, which they treat like real babies and expect bystanders to play along.
That's totally already real.
Yeah, there are like those very realistic looking babies. I don't exactly know what they're for.
Do you want to know?
I don't know. Do you know what
there's a lot of people who are like do videos. There's a whole video culture, like a vlog culture around these babies. Oh my god, yeah, that's a wormhole. Oh, if you want to go down it, it's there.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, like influencers. I mean, I watch a guy who mows people's lawns, so it's not that hard to imagine that people watch people who have fake babies.
Oh, yeah, that's really weird. But yeah, there's a very interesting scene in the book where a woman's walking along pushing this little fake baby in a stroller, and she wants others to kind of play along and admire her baby and
play along with the fiction.
Play along with the fiction, exactly. But then what happens is this older woman like comes close. Oh, look at your baby! But then the older woman grabs the doll and smashes its head against the curb, and the eyeballs fall out, and the head shatters, and then the mother reacts as if her child has literally just been murdered, and she's like keening and like picking up the pieces, and it's everything about it is like so psychologically disturbing. And like one little eyeball like rolls over towards Theo's foot and he's like, I thought about picking it up and giving it to her, but I didn't. It's just, the whole thing is so weird. You see the strangeness of the places people go when like these deep desires are not fulfilled, and how do you react to the woman who's like involved in this fantasy, and is really strange. There are also this rash of group suicides that happen shortly after Omega, but then the government like decides to kind of get on that bandwagon and like assist people, like especially old people, who are considered burdens, with that suicide.
Well, the killing of the old is like science fiction dystopian staple 101.
Yeah,
it's the first thing.
Right. It's like there's no one to take care of you. Yeah, so we'll help you. And then young migrants from other countries are shipped into England to do the manual labor and the caretaking that older English people can't do.
Wait a sec, that's reality.
Yeah.
It is.
She's very prescient.
It is very prescient. Because I don't think these ideas about population collapse were really even on the... I think people were still on the 70s hangover of too many people.
Right. That's what I thought was happening. They didn't realize... Yeah, but when these sojourners, when they hit retirement age, they hit 65, they're shipped back home to die. Like, it's not like then they get taken care of by somebody. It's like, we're going to use up your best years, pay you a minimum, and then kick you out. All crimes are punished with extreme severity. Criminals are sent to this hellish prison island, never to return. The youngest generation, called Omegas, are relationally detached, self-absorbed, violent, and cruel. They perform ritualized killings of random innocent people. And the country is run by a benevolent dictator who calls himself the Warden. And the people gladly hand over all the power to him because he promises to keep them safe and comfortable and to provide them with like a modicum of pleasure up until the end, which for the most part he's able to do. And as long as people can age in relative peace and quiet, they willingly give up on human rights and justice and compassion. All of the costlier virtues just disappear, and comfort is supreme. And that attitude permeates religious movements too. There's like a bit of doom and gloom or fire and brimstone, prophetic Christianity at the start of Omega, but then most of that just peters out into God is love, and love is love, and love is all, and just kind of bland fluff.
Well, what's his name? Tom Holland? Mm-hmm. Dominion guy? Mm-hmm. His next book is All You Need Is Love, which comes from the Beatles lyric.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the cross just gets extracted from Christianity. The suffering is expunged, and it's just all rainbows and marshmallows. So that's the premise in the social setting. But the action of the plot's based around Theo falling in with this Christo-anarchist group, arguably a terrorist group, who call themselves the Five Fishes, and who are petitioning the Warden to reintroduce human rights and justice into society. And one member of the Fishes is a woman named Julian, who, and here's the big spoiler, she turns out to be pregnant. This is the first human pregnancy on Earth in 25 years. And Julian wants to give birth in secrecy, away from the all-controlling Warden and his government, who are, of course, desperate to get their hands on her and on the baby. And she enlists Theo's help and protection, especially after the father of her child is murdered. So the second half of the book involves like their attempted escape, and it culminates in the birth, which is, chock full of Christian symbolism of the Holy Family, of like Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus. And I think that's why P.D. James said she ended up writing a Christian fable by accident. I know, right? The most fitting plot devices and character motifs for James to use ended up echoing Christ's miraculous birth in a shed to an unlikely woman in an oppressive world assisted by a man who's functioning as an older foster father. Like, just all the pieces are right there. She just kind of walked right into it, which is so fascinating to me that she sets up this despairing premise, and the best answer in the context of the story she started was one that just resonates with all those Christian themes.
In a situation like this, where the premise is that science has failed, the only alternative is a miracle. And that's what this is. Because a miracle, and not in the technical sense that Christianity insists about, like, the specifics of a virgin birth, where there was no male semen, to get technical. But a miracle nonetheless, in the sense that no human was able to figure out why it didn't work before, or why it worked here.
That's right.
So
that's right. When the technology fails,
unmastered,
the grace comes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking of science, why don't you read our first quote here?
So this is our section, Western Science Has Become Our God. So in this quote, Theo is describing what it did to humanity's collective psyche to encounter a problem that could not be fixed with science and technology. We are outraged and demoralized, less by the impending end of our species, less even by our inability to prevent it, than by our failure to discover the cause. Western science and Western medicine have not prepared us for the magnitude and humiliation of this ultimate failure. There have been many diseases which have been difficult to diagnose or cure, and one which almost depopulated 2 continents before it spent itself. But we have always, in the end, been able to explain why. We have given names to the viruses and germs which even today take possession of us, much to our chagrin, since it seems a personal affront that they should still assail us, like old enemies who keep up the skirmish and bring down the occasional victim when their victory is assured. Western science has been our God. In the variety of its power, it has preserved, comforted, healed, warmed, fed, and entertained us, and we have felt free to criticize and occasionally reject it, as men have always rejected their gods, but in the knowledge that, despite our apostasy, this deity, our creature and our slave, would still provide for us. The anesthetic for the pain, the spare heart, the new lung, the antibiotic, the moving wheels, and the moving pictures. The light will always come on when we press the switch, and if it doesn't, we can find out why. I share the universal disillusionment of those whose God has died. We have had 25 years and we no longer even expect to succeed. Like a lecherous stud suddenly stricken with impotence, we are humiliated at the very heart of our faith in ourselves. For all our knowledge, our intelligence, our power, we can no longer do what the animals do without thought. No wonder we both worship and resent them. So, one thing I love about reading books that are a few decades older is that they prove how blind we are to the future. Because so much of this is prescient, but what strikes me about this passage is how it just utterly misses where science has brought us today, which is transhumanism.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we've talked before about how Mary Harrington identifies hormonal birth control as the first transhumanist technology. And I think she's correct in defining that threshold by the difference between using medicine to restore normal function and using it to alter normal function. In the case of the pill, obviously its purpose was to render a fertile woman unable to get pregnant. Of course, we could not appreciate at that time the downstream effects of such technology, both specifically in terms of reproductive practices themselves, but also in a larger sense. There is a direct connection, surely, between suspending fertility and changing your body based on a feeling, a personal conviction. As radically pro-choice as I remain, I don't think it's a coincidence that Planned Parenthood, an organization I once really admired and gave money to, is the leading distributor of wrong sex hormones.
Yeah, it's so weird.
My body, my choice has gone from meaning don't legally compel me to carry an unwanted pregnancy to you can choose whether you go through puberty.
Yeah.
The connection between these two practices is the fact that once you normalize manipulation of the body for one reason, no matter how good it is, then any other manipulation seems justifiable, maybe even inevitable. I mean, I still believe that in the privacy of her home and perhaps within the secrecy of her female circle, a woman should not be prosecuted as a criminal for terminating an early pregnancy. And the irony is, given the effectiveness and safety of modern abortive fashions, this would be easily doable. But I want to be clear what I mean here. My vision is not the same vision as Shout Your Abortion, which is the theme of the progressive left, where abortion is viewed as a service, and that means a market. Let's be Illichian, let's be honest. Mm-hmm. And the state's role becomes that of defending a right to that service, or contrary, restricting that so-called right. I don't think anyone owes anyone an abortion. I think that sort of thinking is exactly why Planned Parenthood is now Planned Penishood. I didn't think you would laugh at her. I thought I told that joke before. Timing is everything. Because we have normalized thinking of our bodies as things we service at our own whim. My position is that women are not criminals for making private choices about their fertility. Yeah. The state has no right to, for example, check whether a woman has missed her period.
Absolutely.
And let's not kid ourselves that there aren't some conservatives who would take the kind of invasive measures described in this book, albeit for the opposite situation.
Right.
In order to fulfill their no abortion utopia. Like, the stuff in Project 2025 comes close to that. Oof. I mean, there are people who are talking about restricting interstate travel, which is clearly unconstitutional, that kind of thing.
Since you can't go to another state and get an abortion.
And so how are they going to enforce that? Pregnancy checks at the border?
Oh,
you can imagine.
Shit.
That's the only way you can, you know what I'm saying? Positive rights are always connected to markets. So like a right to something is a positive right. They're always connected to markets, which means they are always going to be subject to state interference as well as economic incentives. Yeah. We've seen this for 70 years after Roe was decided. You know, that market became completely politicized. Yep. And we see it now, even after it has been overturned. And the exact same factors are in place with the medical scandal known as gender-affirming care. Whether doctors are motivated by ideology, by profit, you know, it's out there. It's a thing that exists as a market, and legislatures are reacting. Half of U.S. states have now banned these harmful procedures on minors. But before any of that could happen, the prerequisite was the worship of science, not just to cure, but to reimagine, to recreate, to reconstruct.
Yes.
We believed it was possible to beat nature at her own game. Sex without pregnancy? Sure. Don't want to grow up? No problem. And that's the thing about if you did have a world where abortion was decriminalized and deregulated, you are going to end up where not all people are going to get what they want. Because if you are intimately involved in making that decision about helping someone, your own moral values are going to come into play. Like, you know, it's different. Are you going to help someone who's 5 months pregnant abort? Probably not. It's not safe. I mean, like, you had time. Like, you know what I'm saying? Whereas, like, all of the situations in the market look different. Because they do arrest people who are doing these elective, you know, later abortions, and the people are always the worst people. I'm not the women trying to get them.
No.
The doctors, scare quotes.
Yeah.
These providers are always they're leveraging that
the women's desperation,
that desperation and that control because it is regulated and criminalized, right? So, you know, it's the trade-off, right? It's the trade-off to, like, does my community allow this? And of course, like, progressives want to say that, what your community wants is irrelevant.
We want a universal.
We want any woman, regardless of what people around her think or want, to have access to this. But that's just not how the world works. Or if the world works that way, you have the only other alternative to that is the market, and the market brings the state.
That's
so
right.
It's like,
oh man,
you know, there are no solutions, people. There are only trade-offs, and I would much rather have the trade-off of private, local, decriminalized deregulation.
Or like if it's happening, it's in a sense it's like paying cash. Like that's off the record. It's between individuals. It's like not.
And it has its limits.
Right.
You're not gonna the fourth time your friend comes to you and says, "I don't want to have this baby." You're gonna be like, "Well, why don't you change your behavior?"
Yeah.
And we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about that. And so I'm about to go on a big rant about that.
Bring it.
So I want to stress that on the level of the individual, the pill really did change many, many women's lives for the better.
Yes.
There's no doubt of that. But when a lot of individuals change their behavior, a society changes, and a society is more than the sum of its parts. No. Another great example of this that we do not talk about because we're not allowed to, and Mary Harrington interviewed a guy who wrote a whole series of articles on this, is the example of HIV, of the AIDS epidemic, which happened as a result of a removal, at least in some parts of the country, of a very powerful social stigma against male homosexuality. Nobody cares what lesbians do. Just they don't. Well, I think many people think of the reversal of legal discrimination and a huge reduction in social stigma against gays and lesbians as a wonderful thing, as do I. You would not have had an AIDS epidemic without the promiscuous sex. That's a fact. That's not a judgment. This is not, dear listeners, me saying that AIDS was a punishment for gays and that gays deserved it. That's crazy. That's Westboro Baptist crap. I'm not saying that. I'm merely observing that new behaviors have consequences, and this was the consequence of a new social behavior. Yeah. The language of, this is my identity, this is my right, and this is the behavior that expresses that identity and that right, that's what promiscuous sex was grounded in, that notion. And again, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And yet we worship science as a god whose function is to deliver us from consequences. Oof. And this happened with AIDS. It went from a tragedy, which it was, because nobody deserves to die like that, a tragedy to an opportunity, to a miracle, because antiretrovirals, basically, you can live with AIDS now. I mean, you can basically neutralize HIV so you never get AIDS. That's how antiretrovirals work. So it went from a tragedy to an opportunity to a miracle to a lifestyle. When we went to a play on Broadway in New York together, the playbill we received, literally, there's an advertisement in there aimed at gay men for something called PrEP, which stands for Pre-Exposure Prophylaxis. Approved by the FDA in 2021 for this purpose, PrEP is an antiretroviral, which are the medications used to treat HIV. It's an antiretroviral prescribed to people who may be exposed to HIV. And HIV is not floating in the air, people. It says you're having unprotected sex. Yeah. You don't have to worry. Science has got this. That's the message. Behave however you want. Nothing bad will happen to you. And the progressive tendency is to look at this as a pure good. And certainly, from a high enough vantage point, of course you don't want people to get AIDS if it can be avoided. That's simplistic and it's true. And that same argument was taken for granted in the spaces I grew up in. Why would you want a young woman to get pregnant if it can be avoided? Right? That's what the pill is for. Problem solved. But I couldn't see as a young person in terms of hormonal birth control, and we did a whole episode on this, I saw right away reading that ad for PrEP. Who benefits, cui bono, right? Ultimately, from putting sexually active men on a drug so that there are no consequences to their behavior. Drug companies, that's it. And so you create this environment where a market has been inserted between ourselves and our society. No one even considers anymore the idea that we do not need medical technology to prevent unwanted pregnancy or sexually transmitted diseases. In our dependency on the state or corporations who provide us these medicines, but of course we mask this dependency by transforming the availability of these drugs and procedures into rights. But our dependency, that's the trade-off, right? And I say this as someone who has no desire to outlaw the pill or medical abortifacients or antiretrovirals. I'm not questioning the usefulness or even the appropriateness of these drugs. I'm questioning the naive view of their use at scale. I'm questioning the attitude that pretends there are no trade-offs when an entire society shifts its behavior. We need to speak honestly about this, and we don't. Mary Harrington talks about how the actual consequence of the widespread use of the pill was increased abortion. The naive view of hormonal contraception was literally the opposite of what happened. The idea was you could have all the sex you wanted without consequences. But in fact, what had been keeping unwanted pregnancy rates low was avoidance based on known risk. Once the risk was, in theory, removed, women changed their behavior. But because the pill isn't perfect, many got pregnant anyway. In a real sense, the expectation that the pill promised, that you could reliably have sex without pregnancy, led to the legalization of abortion. Because science had made a promise. And society still had a clear memory of the social impacts of unwanted children. This is really important. The idea that there is an appropriate context in which to bear children existed before all this technology and it exists now. So saying about being pro-choice is not saying have children willy-nilly in all circumstances. Right. That's not what it is. Mm-hmm. The difference is that before this medical technology, social practices were used.
Yeah.
Stigma was real and had real downsides. And so, of course, it was only natural for people to dream of a world where everyone can have sex without stigma, without consequences. And science is the god of that world.
You're right.
But science is not the same type of God as the God of the Bible, no. Which has captured my renewed interest. It is not the same to be bound to God's judgment as it is to feel dependent on a chemical solution to avoid or ignore virtuous action. Science says it is okay to be a slave to our passions. That's the entire cell. And as much as I appreciate its benefits, including birth control and abortion, I am newly aware of its trade-offs. And one of those trade-offs is this new tech birthright to scare quotes, to change sex. Very heavy scare quotes. Mm-hmm. A lot of so-called gender-critical folks believe that you can just turn back the clock. Like, we overshot the mark just a little. Like trans women or women is just an overshoot. Just take that part back, put that little part of the genie back into the bottle, and we go on living as we were before. But I have a much darker view of this. I think that the status quo we're in proves that once transhumanism is the default expectation, there is no way to limit its expression. And no limits, I think, is the perfect opposite to the central notion of the Judeo-Christian God, which is redemption. Why do you need to be redeemed? Because you're flawed, and you can't fix it.
That's right. You need grace. There's almost this distinction. It's like out of technology and science or humility that receives grace. They just seem to be opposites of one another.
And of course redemption is going to go out of style. If there's a technology that promises you, if there's another God, the science God promises you that you don't need redemption. You can just have everything you wanted.
Right. But you're absolutely right. The technology enables us to become slaves of our passions because then we don't. It's so funny to hear you say that because it's such a Catholic way to think, to talk.
What can I say?
Because then you don't, you're not flexing the moral muscle of, I want this thing and I'm going to say no to myself. And now I'm a little bit stronger because there is a me that is not the same thing as my desire. And it can say no to the desire. But like when your identity becomes totally bound up in your desires, then science is what saves you. It's what gives you yourself. You can't be yourself, your best self, your saved persona, your true self without the God of science giving it to you in an injection or whatever, or in a pill. So strange. And
it's only that hard stop of serious consequences that really drives that mechanism. I mean, humans are masters of self-deceit, and, we have to be, because, if we woke up every day and said we're mortal, that would be hard, right? We need a certain level of, pretend that you have years to live.
Fine.
We need a certain level of that.
Yes.
And it's only those hard stops of I can either have my pleasure now or, risk this lifelong consequence. Those are necessary to incite those mechanisms in the brain. Those mechanisms don't operate. It's much harder to maintain those attitudes towards sex if here's this pill you can take and not get pregnant. Mm-hmm. It's just a different modality.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's making me think of, there's this practice within Catholicism of, I think it's called memento mori. It's like you remember your death.
It's St. Jerome with the skull.
Yeah, exactly.
I've seen 1,000 paintings.
Oh, yeah. You remember you're going to die.
That's why it's supposed to work that way.
Yeah, and that is the ultimate limit. It's like, and if you can bring before your mind every day or every night before you go to bed, the fact of the ultimate limit. I try to pray the rosary with my family, and that prayer ends with, pray for us now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
So you're bringing it into your daily life.
You're bringing it in. And it's like, and my children pray that. And remembering, yes, you're going to die. And you will need grace at the hour of your death. You will need grace, because you're going to hit your limit. Yes.
Science will not help you.
Yeah. There are hard limits and you do need help. And you had best be asking starting today. Don't wait to ask until you're literally on death's door. The grace will still come then, but like practice now.
Right.
And that's why even things like fasting or other, practice like these ascetic practices in the church, or like bring a little bit of a limit that you don't have to, that you're choosing into, bring a little bit of death into your life now to face the of it, to feel the frustration of your passions, and to go, because my identity is not in my desires, I will receive grace from God to make it through this moment. I'm okay. Like you have to practice that over and over and over.
And that is the literal opposite of a world where we take for granted that people have a, quote, right to have sex, to have pleasure without consequences. Like birth control is a right.
It's so weird.
Which is weird, and it's not the same discussion, because I'm never going to favor outlawing those things. I just think that's the wrong approach, and I think it's fundamentally not liberal. Mm-hmm. But like, it's a different discussion to say, do we ban these things, and do we characterize these things as rights, and what are these things for? Those are different discussions, and we're so locked into the political polarization of it's a right, it should be outlawed, that we don't have we're missing the whole middle ground. Where we have to talk about what is the relationship between technology and behavior.
That's right. And I feel like that part of that middle ground includes the discussion of like, married couples in the privacy of their home, recognizing their financial limits and their psychological limits, using a technology to help them have like as many children as they can cope with, which is a recognition of their own limits, and using a technology not to bust through limits of like sex with whoever with no consequences. It's like, no, sex with one another for the sake of the long-term good of our whole family, and so that we'll be celebrating our golden anniversary, and that we'll stick together because sex is glue. And we can't afford 12 children, and so it's the use of a technology to actually recognize a whole host of limits that come from being a responsible couple, which is just a very different thing from like, I have a right to sex. But it's like the same tool, but it's being used. It's like you can use a frying pan to fry eggs. You can use a frying pan to like whack someone over the head.
Yes.
I mean, it's like,
should we ban frying pans?
Right. It's like, so I'm not against banning these things because they have a proper use. But what's that Latin phrase, like abuse does not negate proper use.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Abusus non tollit something or other. Show notes. But
show notes.
Yeah.
Don't be catching my Alzheimer's now.
So it's a really interesting direction you took that when you heard that quote. So I feel like you were struck by sort of like the transhumanist blind spot that she had.
I always like to harp on that every show. We're going to be like, George's going on another one of her rants again.
So I felt like the quote could have been written yesterday rather than 30 years ago. I think that COVID was just a real blow to our medicalized overconfidence. We still haven't really figured out like how it started. Was it gain of function research that escaped the lab? Is Fauci the devil? Is it China's fault? Like, was it a raccoon dog at the Wuhan wet market? It doesn't really matter to me what started it, but what's striking is how desperate we are to find answers and to assign blame because we crave control. Like, we cannot abide a mystery. And you can see this craving for control on the other side of things too, like with the rollout of the vaccine. And for the record, I got vaccinated, but I didn't vaccinate my youngest kids. I have extended family members who rejected and shamed people for not getting vaccinated. And I have extended family members who refused vaccination and took sketchy meds from who knows where. Like, I've seen it all. And I love people who've done it all.
And that was the thing about that event. It showed you can live in the same moment in history and come up with completely opposite narratives.
That's right. Completely different worlds, but the same world. And so the vaccine was both our creature, because we made it, and our deity, because there was enormous amount of social and governmental pressure to, follow the science, follow Jesus, follow the science, and submit to getting
in this household. We believe in science. That is a credo.
It's totally a
credo. That is a total credo.
So the vaccine was our slave and our God. And my guess is that a lot of people rebelled against getting the vaccine not because they were truly distrustful of modern medicine, but because they felt this bloated deification of science with a capital S wielded by the government. And that's disturbing. When humans can create something which is meant to save your life, but which is accompanied by enormous pressure. It reminds me of that famous quote from Reagan. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I'm no Reaganite, but that's a great line.
I'm a dead Reaganite. He'd be like a centrist Democrat now.
He probably would be, actually.
I'm like this close to right in the middle. Dead presidents.
And the same problem is seen in the book when fertility disappears, right? The government becomes incredibly intrusive and controlling over people's bodies. Universal semen testing is basically the government forcing every post-pubescent male to ejaculate into a cup on a regular basis, which is pretty sick. And then there are forced gynecological exams for every woman between 15 and 50. So just gone are the days of my body, my choice. Now it's desperate times call for desperate measures. Or in the warden's words, I will do what needs to be done. In this picture of a coercive use of science and technology for the good of humanity, that's deeply frightening. And I think it's born from this overly optimistic deification of tech, the presumption that we can innovate our way out of diseases and death indefinitely and thus avoid having to grieve because we just hate limits. And at some point, there's wisdom and humility in giving up. Like, we all recognize the need for do not resuscitate orders on a personal level. But I think our society needs something equivalent to that, like a collective DNR, a hard stop for other technological medical interventions. Because a DNR recognizes that medicine is merely our creature and not a God that raises people from the dead. And I think the whole realm of, gender affirming care and sex changes, which don't actually change your sex, I think those need a DNR. Just as we recognize when a person's going to die no matter what we do, so we stop trying for the sake of their dignity, I think biological sex is a hard stop, just like death. People say you can't escape death and taxes. We should make it you can't escape death, taxes, and sex. And I want to quote here from the book Begotten or Made by Oliver O'Donovan. It's a slim little volume from, I think, the 80s on reproductive medical ethics. And he writes, Christians should, at this juncture, confess their faith in the natural order as the good creation of God. To do this is to acknowledge that there are limits to the employment of technique and limits to the appropriateness of our making. These limits will not be taught us by compassion, but only by the understanding of what God has made, and by discovery that it is complete, whole, and satisfying. We must learn again the original meaning of that great symbolic observance of the Old Testament faith, the Sabbath, on which we lay aside our making and acting and doing in order to celebrate the completeness and integrity of God's making and acting and doing, in the light of which we can dare to undertake another week of work. Technique, too, must have its Sabbath rest. So the Sabbath is an even better analogy than a DNR, but they get at the same thing. There are times when technique must cease and desist.
Even in the perceived, the perception of, I could do it. It's like you're literally limiting yourself you perceive that you can produce more, that you can do things, that you can overcome that limit. And you're basically honoring this commandment not to do it.
That's right. And I don't even know how often the Jews ever kept the Sabbath. I mean, they were always, all the prophets, they're getting, railing against them for, you're making money on the Sabbath and you're making your slaves work on the Sabbath. They were always breaking the Sabbath because they could.
It's hard.
Because it's hard because everyone has to stop together, and that's the thing. That
collective action
it's
problem.
Collective action. It's the wisdom, the beauty of it is God put that in there, be all y'all, all together, everybody stop working. Even your donkey stops working on this day, right? You all have to do it together or it doesn't work, or you're going to get that, someone's still making an extra buck on the side and harvesting his crops and no one else is. And
tragedy to come.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and it might be controversial to say, but I think that IVF also deserves a DNR or a Sabbath because it turns the natural process of begetting children into the technological manufacture of potential children, as well as the indefinite frozen storage and sale of potential children. It's one thing to take measures to help a woman conceive by healing her body or to help a man's body to generate healthy sperm. That's in the realm of medicine, like you were saying about Mary Harrington. That's healing something disordered, right? But it's another thing entirely to remove conception from personal acts of sexual intimacy into the hands of a for-profit embryo manufacturing lab. Because this takes the begetting of humans, who should be seen as our companions in dignity, of a piece with their parents, and it turns them into human artifacts for purchase and control. Human begetting, O'Donovan says, is our capacity to give existence to another human being, not by making him the end of a project of our will, but by imparting to him our own being, so that he is formed by what we are and not by what we intend. And the best thing for a child is to be the surprising byproduct of their parents' love, not to be the artificial product of their parents' will. And part of what I love about this book, The Children of Men, is that the surprising pregnancy isn't created by scientists or technocrats. The baby's conceived by two people who are disregarded by the government's eugenic scientists because of their disabilities. The mother has this malformed hand, and the father was an epileptic. So these two, quote unquote substandard people who rather ironically are Christians committing adultery end up conceiving without meaning to. So everything about that scenario is life poking at human control and human aspiration. It's life laughing in our faces. Like we're meant to feel humiliated by this. The hypocritical religious people with genetic abnormalities achieve by accident what the technocrats can't do on purpose. And I really think that's part of the message of the book. Like you can't receive the grace, the surprise of life unless you stop trying to control everything. Or put another way, grace descends on the Sabbath, on the day when you put your tools down.
You started this episode talking about growing up with your brother who has Down syndrome. And that is such a powerful image of the byproduct of love. And the challenges of that. Because that doesn't come out the same for everyone all the time.
That's right.
And so it becomes this act of faith to roll the dice, so it, so to speak, genetically, because we know the cause of that condition. We understand it scientifically. And in a sense, this is another collective action problem, because that only works if everyone is facing that same chance lottery together.
Yeah.
Because, this, that, in some countries, there basically are no more Down syndrome babies because of early prenatal screening and termination.
Right. Like the Nordic countries.
Yes.
I think. Yeah. I remember reading an article about that recently, and it deeply disturbing me because, like I mentioned at the beginning, the fact of my brother's combination of limitations and gifts made all of us in the family restructure ourselves into the kind of people who loved and played and could be silly. Like my family, like if my brother hadn't been born, we would be very different people. Like we were all very kind of like, me and my dad and my brother especially, we're super nerds. We're very intellectual. We're like all up in our heads. And like the gift that my little brother is to make us forget about ourselves and get out of our minds and get into the feels, I'm like, my dad's like PhD brain, but every day he plays Sorry with my brother, like multiple times, and takes him out to throw ball together and like reads him Mother Goose, and like, you don't get that unless you're given the gift of a surprise of well, now for something entirely different.
The gift of a lack of choice.
Yes.
Is what you're describing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's very much what happens in a larger sense in a society where everything is a choice, is that you lose even a sense of what it means not to have such control. You can't even, and you don't witness it, and you don't experience it, and those things are intimately connected because humans are envious. We know from like the story, these stories of infertility turning into miraculous fertility in the Bible are enough to just give us that sense of what it must have been like to suffer in an unequal world like that. It's totally natural to like reject, resist, fight that with every tool we can with our big brains.
Yeah.
But the counterpoint to that, the trade-off for that, is this: we lose sight of the chance in our own creation or createdness, or how, because our creation just isn't being born, coming out, and then we're like, that's who we are forever.
Yeah, no, we're shaped.
It's part of what else happens around us. You give up, you take control, and we don't realize, I don't think, that we're losing that we're losing that other thing. We're losing that whole other sphere. Right.
Like we presume that to have control is automatically good, and that to lose control, that when you lose control, it will automatically be bad. It's like, no, you really don't know. You might have control, and that might be the worst thing for you. You might be totally out of control, and it might be the most amazing, surprising blessing of your life. You just don't know either way.
Right. But if there's a sector of people operating in that modality, then the natural reaction is like, well, how come, I mean this in the gentlest way possible, but it's the idea of like, well, if they're not having any children with Down syndrome, why do I have to? That's the mindset That's the mind virus that takes over in that choice modality.
Right. Because then it sees the child as like, oh, this is a defective product.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's like, return to sender. This is not what I ordered.
We're already there.
No.
We are already there.
It's like, just like it's wrong to have that sort of consumerist frame when you go to church, it's like it is wrong to have the consumerist frame when you have children. When you have children, it should be the framework of hospitality.
But the only way you get there in society, and I feel like this is one of the things I'm learning about my own life, the only way you get there is to see that modeled.
Yeah.
The only way you get there, the only way you can trust
see it
the
embodied
universe
in another
to give
person.
you that thing. I mean, either you have a faith conversion where you just feel it, or you see it modeled, you see it handled.
Yeah.
You see it all around you. You see,
someone,
if everyone else trusts, I can trust.
Yeah. So the capacity to trust would be mimetic. And if everyone is if everyone's cynical and consumerist around you, then you're like, well, I got to make sure I get mine and I get the best.
Yes. Yeah. And then you see how hard it is to raise children with, we call them special needs, which is, we don't have to dissect that phrase, but like, those needs are only special because like we've decided that there's a limitation on what needs are. Like we have an acceptable set of needs and the other ones are special outside the needs. It's like, so, I mean, it's not a wonder that women are reluctant to have children when the happy path is so narrow and like even all paths tend to be pretty lonely. I mean, you know?
I guess if what you perceive is that my life is to be happy. But again, that's like looking for an experience. It's like, I can't guarantee the happiness. Like, what is that Viktor Frankl says? Like, happiness cannot be pursued. It can only ensue from doing something meaningful. It's like, okay, my life is about doing good, virtuous things and loving the people in my vicinity. And then however the chips fall, okay. But like, I can't pursue a feeling.
But the sense of control is very related to this individualism. And of course, the byproduct of that, as we were going to see that we see in this book, is the isolation that produces. Like, the product of control is always loneliness. I think. That's sort of what I've been thinking about lately.
Yeah. You want to take that in the next quote then, because it gets somewhat into loneliness.
Washing down nihilism with a bottle of claret. In this quote, Theo's old college professor Jasper is describing his reaction to not being able to have children of his own, and to the phenomenon of omega in general. It doesn't worry me particularly. I'm not saying I hadn't a moment of regret when I first knew Hilda was barren, the genes asserting their atavistic imperatives, I suppose. On the whole, I'm glad. You can't mourn for unborn grandchildren when there never was the hope of them. This planet is doomed anyway. Eventually, the sun will explode or cool, and one small, insignificant particle of the universe will disappear with only a tremble. If man is doomed to perish, then universal infertility is as painless a way as any. And there are, after all, personal compensations. For the last 60 years, we have sycophantically pandered to the most ignorant, the most criminal, and the most selfish section of society. Now, for the rest of our lives, we're going to be spared the intrusive barbarism of the young, their noise, their pounding, repetitive, computer-produced so-called music, their violence, their egotism disguised as idealism. My God, we might even succeed in getting rid of Christmas, that annual celebration of parental guilt and juvenile greed. I intend that my life shall be comfortable, and when it no longer is, I shall wash down my final pill with a bottle of claret.
Yeah. So this quote makes my point, for me about the connection between loving children and loving Christmas. I mean, Jasper perfectly embodies that cynical attitude of like seeing through things to what they really mean, which is always something pathetic or gross. Like, this is the dark side of looking through an evolutionary psychology lens. Like, you keep seeing through people until you lose sight of the person entirely, and all that's left are drives and genes. In the past, I would have attributed this attitude to someone like Richard Dawkins, but even he has spoken recently in defense of the celebration of Christmas. I don't know. Have you heard him talk about that?
He's realizing that if you have to have culture, Christian culture is preferable.
It's pretty
to
good.
Choices.
Yeah, he'd rather sing. Yeah, he likes to sing the old carols. So I have more respect for him now than I used to. Like, his habits and enjoyments are more Christian than his ideas, and good for him. Like, I think we all need that kind of hypocrisy, like the good kind, where our actions and our preferences are actually better than our propositions in our head,
isn't that the
and our beliefs.
win-win of the cultural of cultural values like that. It's like you don't have to believe. You get the benefit of the extra stuff.
That's right.
Like some people need to believe.
Yeah.
We know that it can't be done without any belief.
That's right.
But
That's
it doesn't. But I mean, that's the thing about taking all comers. Children aren't there to like worship Jesus crucified on the cross.
Exactly. So why can't Richard Dawkins be here to sing, the first Noel? Like, in a sense, like, I don't care what's going on in his head, but maybe he has a nice baritone, and he's here with everybody.
No, and some people, I know, someone in my Torah class sings in the Catholic church choir.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
So, I mean, I'm telling you.
Yeah.
It does
Welcome
take
everybody.
The idea that takes all comers.
That's right, because certainly children are not there because they subscribe to all of the doctrines and they understand all the things, and they said, yes, that sounds plausible, I believe. It's like, that is not why they're there. They are brought, right? And, it doesn't have to be all about, do you subscribe to all the beliefs? But back to Jasper. So it's hard for me to take seriously his cavalier dismissal of the world as doomed and of children as intrusive, egotistic barbarians.
Well, they are if you raise them wrong.
Yeah.
I'm on the Jordan Peterson train on that. Like,
okay.
If your kids aren't acceptable at age 5 to another adult, you're in trouble. Wrong.
Yeah. It's definitely possible for parents to fail. Like, there's good enough, but then there's also
not good enough.
Yeah. So Jasper's tone, this kind of bitter flippancy, it sounds to me like online incels talking about women. Like, it's the tone that you adopt when you had hope and then were burned. Like the tone you take when desire hurts too much. Like, you look stronger and cooler to other people when you can, like, shake it off and feign indifference. It's just another mode of grief avoidance. Like, you can avoid facing your sorrow by trying to control everything and by preventing things from going wrong, right? That's Western science as our God. But you can also avoid facing your sorrow by pretending you didn't really care in the first place. And plus, everything's doomed anyway, the heat death of the universe and everything. So why worry? But it's actually this attitude that I find juvenile, not the celebration of Christmas or the noisy antics of children or the idealism of youth. It's this kind of self-conscious cleverness or the witty nihilism that was present in the book Lady Chatterley's Lover, which we read, a few podcasts ago. And in that novel, the clever jacks are the young survivors of World War I who were traumatized by death on every side. And so it's verbal wit as a shield from sorrow. So the charitable reading of Jasper here is to see him as a vulnerable and lonely man, who wishes that his protege Theo would take him into his home as he faces aging and death. But Jasper would rather commit suicide than admit outright how much he needs another human being for care and connection. Like, Jasper fails his own wife. He ships her off to a quietus ritual where she supposedly commits group suicide, where she's actually just murdered, and he's not there. And then Theo fails Jasper. Like, at an earlier point in the story, Theo himself is so solitary and set in his comfortable ways that he refuses to take on the responsibility of bringing Jasper into his home to help him. Like, Theo is not a good person at the start of the story. And later we find that Jasper has actually killed himself, and not with a pill and a bottle of claret, but with a gun to the head. And I see his suicide as being partly Theo's fault because Theo didn't take the bid. Like, he refused the responsibility of caretaking. Theo failed his daughter, he failed Jasper, and ironically, Theo's the one who ends up being chosen to be responsible for the one pregnant woman in the world, like the one baby in the world. So here's the Christian fable coming through again, right? Like, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. It's from 1 Corinthians 1. So you've got this morally weak and shameful man who obviously cannot be trusted around children and the elderly, and he is chosen to have the most important caretaking role in human history. So I digress, but back to Jasper. In societies with plummeting birth rates, there are more and more Jaspers who don't have anybody to help them. So this is not a theoretical problem. It's already here. I was reading the other day in the New York Times an article titled, "For Older People Who Are Lonely, Is the Solution a Robot Friend?" And a widow interviewed for it talked about Ellie Q, this voice-activated robotic AI companion, and she said this about it. "She's the closest thing to a human that I could have in my home, and she makes me feel cared for. She makes me feel important." And I shared this with my family, and they were all horrified. My kids were like, "But that's what people are supposed to do for other people." And, there's been hype for years about, like, caretaking robots saving Japan with its aging population problem. But that appears to be failing, as you might expect, because care robots require care themselves, right? Like, it's turtles all the way down, right? Somebody has to do the dirty work, whether that's caring for the elderly or maintaining the robot that cares for the elderly. We just need people. Not everything is replaceable. Like, mechanical things don't reproduce and maintain themselves. There's only so far you can kick that can. The God of science can't save us by making life once we've lost the capacity, and it can't save us by accompanying our elderly into death when we have lost the will to do it. And the book emphasizes this over and over again. Like every scene in which someone has died, usually violently, there's a number of deaths, the question of what do we do with the body arises. And every time, Theo recognizes what he owes the dead. Like he has to bury them, or he has to close their eyes, or clean them up, or at one point he reads the burial service from the Anglican prayer book, and it's in his ability to be responsible for the dead. It's in that he slowly becomes responsible for the living. Like those things are intimately connected.
Yeah,
but that really struck me.
Only in the visceral, it takes the visceral need of a corpse to sort of like, jumpstart him back and to be like, oh wait, there's obligations. And
right.
Because I'm here, I'm obligated.
Yes. Yeah, that language of owe, the word owe and obligation and responsible, those came up all throughout the book.
I mean, for me, this is a passage that speaks to our moment unflinchingly. Now, this is, although it's not just old people, it's really like young people, right? Young people no longer see the possibility or purpose to having children. Like, it's too expensive, it's pointless, and many of them are influenced by the idea that there are too many people already, or that climate change will destroy the world. I mean, that's a real thing now. People really believe that. But there's a difference between population growth and population replacement.
Yes.
There are ways to limit the former while maintaining the latter. And really what we're facing is the overall population of the world may decline, but it's not in danger of extinguishing itself. The problem is that, if you miss a generation, then you have all these old people and no young people to take care of them. And that causes some ills specific to our society because it's capitalist.
Yeah.
I read a book, a few years ago called Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. It's a Jared Diamond book. He wrote like Guns, Germs, and Steel. I think is his most famous book. He talks about how certain island societies had all sorts of practices to limit population growth.
Oh, yeah.
Like, birth control to the extent they understood it. I mean, they understood how people got pregnant. So,
Yeah.
Abortion, infanticide, even like sending people out on the boats to like just bye-bye.
Yeah, go find
Because to allow population to grow would have been fatal to the carrying capacity of their environment because they were living on like an island,
They recognized their limits.
And in some ways, I think the weird rejection of procreation is in part an understandable reaction to an unrelenting growth mindset of capitalism.
Yes.
Combined with a societal memory of, we talked about this before, of many children spending decades having and raising children. Capitalism is not a system that can function in markets that never grow.
Yeah.
And a young girl who sees her mother bear 12 children has a good idea about whether she wants that to be her own fate.
Yeah.
And so markets adapt such that economic growth is achieved without replacement birth rates. Immigration takes care of population growth, and selling more and more services and goods to the childless takes care of the rest.
Yeah.
So if this book were written now, I can imagine that the recourse of the doomed would be to recreate family via AI.
Yeah.
Just as you talked about.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have an online boyfriend.
Yeah.
Which makes no sense.
Yeah.
Make it make sense.
It's becoming more and more popular.
But I mean, if most of your reality is like online, your most frequent thought becomes your most present reality. And if you're on the phone, like a lot of young people are, and some old people too.
Right. If you're texting with people and that's your primary mode of interaction, or chatting or texting, and you're not embodied with people, then if you got a good AI that can pass the Turing test and it's pretty fun, how different is that on a felt level from, just having a boyfriend who you don't see, but you just talk on the phone? And
I mean, I'm sure plenty of online dating relationships fall into that pattern.
Yeah.
You talk on the phone, and you're like looking forward to the future, you're imagining the future, but then the person on the other one of you doesn't really want to have that future. And it's just, and then one day it just ends. Because you've made it up in your brain, right?
Like we need to get our bodies back involved.
Right. And what can trigger that, right? So as I said to you in a text this week, relationships that are only imaginary, these sorts of relationships that are only imaginary are really only necessary and possible for people who have all their real needs met by strangers.
Yeah.
Someone they don't know grows their food, someone they hire fixes their toilet, all those other vagaries of human life that does exist in meat space, right?
Yep.
We do not depend on the people we are in close proximity to. We have a market that basically abstracts all that away. We just pay for service, right? Yep. And the result of that is that we grow lonely.
Exactly.
So it's like, talk about unexpected downsides to technological advancement. I mean, we're so powerful. We're so the abundance is crazy. I mean, supermarkets are crazy.
Yeah.
From a perspective of even 200 years ago.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
But when we don't need people, everything changes, right? I'm beginning to think that it is only direct need that can force people into proximate relationships at any significant scale.
Yeah.
In this case, Julian's pregnancy, because it is so politically significant, so volatile, right?
Yeah.
It forces Theo and the others in that group to act directly. It forces them to assume a personal responsibility.
That's right.
The pregnancy itself represents an exception, a miracle really, but the need to intervene personally is also an exception in the world in which everything is managed at scale, impersonally, technologically, scientifically. Scientists, like the ones that will become involved if Julian is discovered, are the ones who manage birth. Julian's desire to give birth in isolation, surrounded only by those she trusts who are not specialists, means that she's really relying on nature to do its thing, so to speak.
Yeah.
And this has to be intended as a commentary on our present world, where science takes the place of both such local relationships and a faith in nature to get it right most of the time, and to accept its decree when it does not. Again, collective action problem. No one is going to accept the risks of unassisted, untechnologized birth if the other people are in the hospital getting all that special stuff. No one's going to accept that, right? And since this book was written, the primacy of science in reproduction has only gotten more extreme. Between surrogacy, the quest to make gametes out of any human cell, and the perverted fantasy of male pregnancy, science continues to offer the vision of a world without limits. This is a happy story, right? This is the miracle, and it ends there at the birth scene, really.
Yes.
Theo takes out the warden, and it's implied that with all the risks and dangers associated with that he will assume that role himself.
Yes.
And we also take this miracle as, a representative idea that, it's assumed or presumed or maybe hoped for, at least, that this could be happening all over the world, that humanity has come through
the bottleneck,
and is now somehow, some people some men are fertile again,
right? But it won't be the people we expect.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the worst is over. We can have children again. And because it ends on this high note, there is none of this sense over and over Julian is it's going to be okay. And but we know historically that lots of children died very close to after birth. Yeah. Lots of women died in childbirth. We know that. Yeah. And so it becomes that collective action problem where no one wants to assume the risk because now they think the risk is optional. They think, oh well, I'm not going to go give birth in the middle of nowhere with no heart monitors and blah blah blah.
Right.
Because that means I'm going to be denied my right to have a good outcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can't look at the.
But it's so ironic too though, because I've given birth in hospitals, but because I was too afraid to do a home birth, although I know women have done it. But
of course you were.
Right.
Because it's
But at the same time, it's once you go into the hospital, you are on their clock. And if you don't give birth at a certain time, well, honey, we need to get you some Pitocin. We need to get this moving along. And, there are only certain times the doctors want to be doing C-sections, because if most women naturally will give birth in the middle of the night. And how many doctors really want to come in the middle of the night? And so, you look at, when are C-sections scheduled? During normal working hours. They don't go by what's best for the woman's body. It's a system, and it's regimented, and you go in there and you are actually getting a whole host of new risks because they're going to want to induce you to rush you along, and then they're going to want to hook you up to things, and then you're more at risk for now that we're monitoring the baby's heart rate, the heart rate looks bad, you better have a C-section. And it's most women don't actually need them, but the rates are very high because you get on that treadmill, and then one intervention leads to another intervention leads to another, and then boom, it's it's risks both ways. So
right. And what are the trade-offs? And then it becomes then you face the extremes of those things where, those things generate reaction. I mean, I read one story once of a woman who had been sort of kind of really bought into sort of home birth, no medical intervention at any cost, and she was late. And she delayed and delayed and delayed, and eventually...
Did she lose the baby?
Yeah.
And that's the thing, right?
Because people,
you're so afraid of the system.
That little band of renegades.
There's a very conspiracy-minded, the hospital's going to screw you over.
Yes.
And it's like, well, they might, but they also might save your life or the baby's life.
Right. And you don't know.
You don't know which one you are, which pregnancy you have.
Because you don't know the future.
Yeah. Which is why, for all of my births, I had a doula with me. And a doula is, someone who helps you through labor, and she's there as the non-laboring woman to advocate for you in the hospital. If you're like, I really don't want a C-section, she can hold the doctors at bay for a little longer while you, make it through another contraction. And she's there to help the husband, who also is freaking out, doesn't know what's going on. She's like, this is fine. It's super helpful. I mean, she functions more, kind of like a midwife, but so it's not just the hospital professionals. It's someone who's like your advocate. It's another woman. So helpful. And she helps you know when to go to the hospital, like how long to labor at home and all of that. But yeah, it's more that intimate circle of woman to woman with the hospital as the backup.
I mean, it's really hard to imagine a world where we choose to retreat from this technological paradigm. I mean, I feel like the only way some of these things go away is if we lose, there's a collapse and we don't have
enough people to run
the things. We don't have enough resources to spare for that kind of setup. Because we're too focused on growing potatoes in our backyards or something.
Well, that's the premise of the movie Interstellar, I think, right? The main character's wife dies of cancer because all the MRI machines are dismantled to grow potatoes because climate change destroyed all the food production. And it was humanity trying to retool, and then certain technology gets taken away. And is it better? Is it worse?
Right.
Yes.
But even
Both.
seeing that as a sort of a tragedy of we once had this pinnacle of these things we could do,
that's
and now
how
we
it's
don't.
framed.
Even that is a different paradigm than never having had that. Accepting being a little more, maybe charitable is the wrong word, but just being a little more based in our notion that there's a lot of stuff that's not in our control, and it makes you appreciate when things go right. I mean, I think that's a lot of what this is. It's even the whole idea of medical malpractice is grounded in this idea that medicine should go a certain way. It owes us this outcome. And of course, medicine doesn't work that way. And with any technology, the results are highly polarized.
That's right.
You can do an operation and have incredible success for the vast majority of women, say for hysterectomies, for example, which I found out was after C-section, the most common surgery performed on women.
Yeah.
1 a minute.
I don't know. It's a third of women or something end up with a hysterectomy by a certain age. It's nuts. It's really high. I'm seriously?
Right. But I mean, what is that driven by? It's driven by this knowledge idea that we can intervene, therefore we should intervene, that comfort is a medical goal, right? Which in a society where you don't have anesthetic or where you don't understand germ theory, in a previous time period, obviously, comfort, there was a different measure of the trade-offs between going for comfort versus going for safety. We brought down, we can lower risks of infection, we can mitigate pain and stuff like that. Most of these surgeries are going to be successful, at least in the measurable terms, for you didn't die, you didn't have any life-threatening ongoing consequences as a result of this. But there are going to be cases where the happy path was not the path, and people are going to have really bad results because we're not robots.
Right.
Our bodies aren't the same one to the other. Doctors aren't the same one day to the next.
That's right.
There's going to be happenstance. There's going to be chance. There's going to be accidents.
We expect a uniformity of outcome, like a manufactured.
Yes.
I get my specific exact surgery, exactly how you got it, and you had a good outcome, so I will get a good outcome. I'm buying the same product.
Right.
It's there's human fingerprints all over this thing. The nurse, the doctor, the day, your body.
Lunch, what music's playing.
There's so much contingency.
I mean, who knows?
So much contingency in it that we just can't bear the reality, that we shield ourselves from the fact that so much of this is luck and contingency and fortune.
Yes, and if you happen to be on the unhappy end of that inevitable trade-off, risk-benefit thing, then it's not so great for you.
No.
And medicine doesn't have a recourse for that because those are baked in.
Yeah.
Those you can never.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is part of why, when my friend got cancer and she she was the one who got like the awful roll of the dice of contingency, right? And that's what made me realize, like, oh, that's going to be me with something. I don't know whether it's going to be me or my kid or something's going to go awful. There will be my turn at some point, and I have to get ready. Rather than thinking like, we've got to do everything we can to do all the cancer research so this never happens to anyone ever again. It's like, that's so inflated. I mean, like, yes, I'm for cancer research. I used to work in cancer research. And like, I have to do the memento mori. I have to do the things I need to do to be ready for whatever that awful thing is.
That's interesting, because we both had friends who died. I don't think my friend wasn't as young as your friend, but still, dying in your mid-50s is still like,
that's so
considered an outlier. My reaction to her death was like, wow, medicine sucks. And I mean, medicine doesn't suck. I mean, in the sense that, yeah, medicine's great. I mean, it's amazing. It definitely, for a lot of people who get the happy path, it extends life, it improves the quality of life. I mean, my father would have died 15 years before he did if it weren't for like the miracles of medicine, like, for sure.
Yeah.
But my reaction to her experience was like, this is medicine being used in denial of reality. And it's just basically because her life was lost when she had when the cancer was diagnosed, because the way it metastasized was like, it was already too late.
No treatment was going to save her.
No.
But I mean, was she still subjected to it?
The statistics are like 11% after 5 years. Okay. And that doesn't mean you're cured. It just means you're alive.
Yeah, you mean utterly in pain and miserable. Yeah.
Right. And so, I don't know. I guess for me, it's just, I have this huge skepticism about like this very, maybe almost bordering on paranoia of like, wow, like you really have to weigh the risk benefit. You have to be willing to take that chance. It's just like having a kid in a sense. Like you have to be willing to roll the dice, because that's what you're doing. Because you're not a statistic. The statistics can say, 95, 8, 9% of these surgeries are fine. But like
you might be.
You don't have a right to belong to one portion of the other.
No. There's just a lot fewer guarantees in life than sort of, modern medicine and, modern governments that talk about rights kind of make us feel as though there are things, I suppose the word is entitlement, but we just feel entitled to a whole heck of a lot of good stuff going our way. That's just not in line with reality. And so it's like, this went wrong, quick, sue. Or quick, like, prosecute, quick. It's like, that's just life. It's contingency. That's limits.
Yeah, and the more you intervene, the more you're creating these situations where, it's Plinko. You're dropping the thing in the layout, and it's gonna plink down to wherever it goes. And, it doesn't matter if, most of the things drop down into the realm of the good outcome.
Yeah.
Some of them aren't gonna.
That's right.
And I don't know. That's what the tragedy of this whole gender affirming care really is based on. It's like, it's a lie within the lie. Because even things that are like justifiable treatments, like you have cancer, let's remove it. I mean, there's a logic to that, right? Mm-hmm. There's no logic to this idea that you feel a certain way, let's change your body.
No.
And so you start with the illogic of it, and then you go introduce all these harms. It's pure iatrogenesis, because none of it is actually restoring any health.
That's right.
There's no health that's missing.
That's right. It is pure iatrogenesis. Yeah, the introduction of harm. Not even in it. It's not curing anything with a side and then having a bad side effect. It's like, no, you're just bringing side effects.
The treatment doesn't go wrong. It is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that sense, it's like the perfect example of the over-application of this medicinal, rights-based worldview. It's like the pinnacle of what that is when it goes wrong, is it looks like gender-affirming care.
I think entitlement is a good word for it, because you feel, and entitlement gets confused. Entitlement covers both those areas where you're entitled to someone giving you the service and covering the cost. I mean, that that's the idea behind universal healthcare, right? But then there's also the feeling that gloms onto that, which is what we've been talking about, which is you're entitled to the good outcome. And I don't know how you wean a society off of that except through calamity.
Yeah. Right. And calamity that then hopefully makes you remember you have neighbors and family and friends. And so I feel like then the ultimate solution comes down to like, well, damn, we have to take care of each other. Like, we're responsible to each other.
Right. And care isn't about, if we realize that the modality of care isn't about ending suffering. It's about, it's service not towards this goal. Like, it's not service in the sense that, like, I'm going to pay for something, I'm going to be 100% satisfied, it's going to, blah, blah, blah. Right. It's intimately connected to the fact that suffering is a given. Yes. And we're all in it together. Yes. And we're serving one another in a different capacity. Yes. We're holding each other up. We're not perfectifying, or that's not a word, but
you're not accompanying each other in the suffering that can't be removed.
Right.
So it's like you come alongside and you help them bear the weight of the thing that cannot be removed.
It's like the removal of the cross from Christianity in this book is a symbol for, we've agreed that we don't tolerate suffering. We're making that go away. Don't live over here.
Right. When what you need to do is like you need to learn how to carry your own cross and then help someone else carry their cross when theirs is too heavy, because not everyone's is going to be the same weight.
No, and not everyone was going to have the same capacity.
That's right.
I mean, that's why I watched that guy, the lawnmower guy.
Yeah.
Because he's out there showing you that, like, not everyone has the capacity all the time to get there.
Clean their yard up.
To clean their yard up.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a beautiful example. He's very graciously helping people who are just so far behind, who can't do it. He's like, I can do that.
Right.
Like he has extra. He has capacity.
Yes.
And I think that's the thing when we kind of pay people and make everything into paid services, then the people who actually have capacity don't get to give it. Like, there are people out there. I mean, maybe you, listener, have some. Like, go find someone who needs it. Yeah. And you can have a relationship with someone.
Right.
The giving and the receiving. But that happens in, a world where there's differences that can't be ironed away, and hierarchies. Some people have, some people don't have. You can fix that, try to fix that with tech, and it doesn't work. Or you can address it with love, which I think is really the only way.
It's certainly a paradigm that has a lot of successful examples. And again, like, that paradigm can take place in a context of belief, like in a church, in a synagogue, in a religious practice. But it doesn't have to.
No. But right, those houses of worship are a great place where people are intentionally thinking about how do we do this together for one another and for people who don't attend here. It's not just for the members, it's also for the people who aren't members. And so they're thinking about how to do that.
Right. It's a place where you can incubate that.
Yeah.
Like, that can exist wherever, whenever.
Yeah.
But you can also consciously say, we're going to be in this building, we're going to do this thing, we're going to practice these things, and we're going to cultivate that attitude, that practice. And I mean, this book is about a man who starts off with all the sort of typical, problems of, isolation and sort of hopelessness and just this resignation towards his own uselessness, basically.
Right. His privacy gone sour, And
I think, like, that's always a temptation, because who wants to deal with the friction of other people's... People are difficult. Like, we rub against each other.
Yep.
And it's not always a great feeling.
Yeah.
But, I mean, again, no solutions, only trade-offs. If we're at the point now where you're getting your food delivered by Uber Eats, like the contactless delivery, like that, doesn't that feel like, COVID almost like put too fine a point on it? It's like so on the nose you couldn't make it up.
Right,
like a service, literally, where the accommodation is that you never have to see the person who is bringing you your food.
It's like symbolism happens. I mean, that's, I
mean, holy bleep. That's that's on a level.
Yeah.
And so you'd never see anyone who makes your basic needs. And then, of course, what's your recourse? Your fake friends, your fake AI families. But your fake AI family isn't going to help when there's no more services.
That's right.
In fact, your fake AI family will be the first to go.
Yeah. People need real people in the flesh.
What are we doing next time? Do we know?
We talked about that, reading that book, Submission.
Another book about changing sexual mores.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get through it?
I haven't read it yet.
Hold? Oh. I'll post the announcement soon.
Okay, good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.